Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and today we're going to take a short break from posting draft or limited videos to share some of the tips and tricks that I've been using for fairly decent success in Theros Beyond Death. Keep in mind, this is aimed at limited, not constructed. If you want to see constructed tips, probably not the best place to come. But if you're here to talk about limited, then you came to the good place. So I used to do videos like this, just sharing a couple, key card interactions or niche things you can do to give yourself a little bit of an edge, but I really only do that with formats that I very much enjoy. In this case, Theros Beyond Death has been one of my favorite formats in the last couple formats. I can't think of one that I've enjoyed quite as much, at least in the last year or so. But Theros Beyond Death has definitely piqued my interest, and I've been drafting it nonstop, so I figured now would be a good time to just kind of share some of the things that I've noticed in the format. And if any of these stand out as, something useful, then this video is worth making. A lot of these are just going to be simple card interactions between two cards, and a lot of them are things you'll already know, but a couple of them are just kind of play patterns that I've noticed that I wanted to go ahead and clarify for maybe newer players who are looking for just a quick video to watch that can give them a tiny little edge. Again, we're not going super deep here or like all-in competitive here, but I am trying to bring a couple interactions to the forefront of people's minds. And again, we're geared towards newer players or people who may just be looking for a little something extra when it comes to Theros Beyond Death Limited. Again, these are in no particular order. They are just, kind of hodgepodge together, but hey, did what I could. That being said, before we get into our tips and tricks, feel free to subscribe below if you find that anything on this list pops out to you, if anything has been helpful, or if you just learned something new that you otherwise didn't know. Feel free to subscribe below. We post videos mostly weekly when I get the chance, but mostly limited content. And you can find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. The first tip I wanted to go ahead and bring up is the way that a particular card in this set interacts with some of the demigods in this set. The demigods being the uncommon cycle with power or toughness determined by your devotion to their color. In this particular case, the card that we're talking about is Heliod's Punishment. This is the 1-in-white aura that enters with 4 task counters on it, and the enchanted creature can't attack, block, loses all of its abilities, and you can tap it to remove a counter from Heliod's Punishment, and then once the last counter is removed, you destroy the enchantment. So it basically arrests a creature for 4 turns, requiring that creature to tap in order to start removing those counters so that it'll be quote-unquote unlocked. I'm not a big fan of Heliod's Punishment unless you have multiple ways to recur it, or if you are an extremely aggressive deck. But what I find is a lot of people just throw Heliod's Punishment into their decks, they slap it on a creature, the game goes long, and eventually, even though they might push through a few points of damage, you get your creature back. It's almost like a Banish and Light that expires, and that does not seem like a card that I typically want to play, but I noticed a neat little interaction between specifically these two demigods, Daxos and Timuret. These are the two demigods in the cycle that have toughness based on their devotion, whereas the other ones have power based on their devotion. If you put Heliod's Punishment on either of these creatures, it actually just straight up kills the card, because the key point here being that Heliod's Punishment removes all abilities from the creature, so it actually removes the characteristic that defines what their toughness is, and when that can't be defined, it's just substituted as 0. So throwing a Heliod's Punishment on a Daxos will make it lose that ability, and it will become a 2/0 regardless of what your devotion to white is. Same deal for Timuret. This actually took me a little bit of time to figure out. I had an opponent put a Heliod's Punishment on a Timuret, and my Timuret died, and it took me a while to figure out why my Timuret was dead. But it's a nice little key card that you can sideboard in against these cards. Daxos in particular, not super strong, but Timuret has been an all-star in this format, and Heliod's Punishment is a nice way to deal with it, especially since these two cards tend to have really high toughness, and they can be difficult to get around. Next up, I want to call attention to, I guess, an infinite combo that you can achieve in Limited, which is not something you can do very often, or at least a close to infinite combo, depending on which cards you have. You might have actually even had this combo in your deck without realizing it, or you can actually go into a draft planning on drafting this entire combo, because none of the pieces are rare. The first key card here is Archon of Fallen Stars. This is the big Cow Rider guy who's a 4/4, and when he dies, importantly, you may return target enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield, which is pretty good. In general, I've liked this card quite a bit, but the combo is with Minions Return. This is the flash enchantment that says when the enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control. So if you manage to stick an Archon and you manage to put a Minions Return on it, whenever the Archon dies, the Minions Return will trigger. It'll put the Archon back on the battlefield, and you also have the Archon trigger to put an enchantment back on the battlefield. So you can put the Minions Return back on the Archon. In other words, these two cards basically bring each other back, and it's extremely hard to get rid of unless there's exile effects involved or taken away abilities or something along those lines. Where this goes infinite or close to it is with a card like Lampad of Death's Vigil, which can actually enable the strategy of making the card die, bringing it back to the battlefield, die, back to the battlefield. But for each mana you spend on this combo, you get to drain your opponent for a life. So once you've assembled this, every mana essentially starts killing your opponent, and you can do it as many times as you can pay for. Obviously, Lampad is one of the better uses here, but you can also use stuff like Soul Reaper of Mogus to draw cards, or any other sack outlet that gives you a benefit, and go off that way. Note that Lampad does have a mana requirement, so this isn't exactly infinite, but I suppose if you have the card Woe Strider, that you could go actually infinite, since that one can sacrifice creatures without any sort of mana cost. And just as an added little bonus, if you want to add a bunch of extra colors to your deck, here's some cool things you can do with this combo. Since an enchantment is entering the battlefield over and over and over again, with the Minions Return, you can mill your opponent out with Sage of Mysteries, you can gain infinite life with Nexus Wardens, or if you're like me and you want to jam the third and fourth color into your deck, you can make infinite power flyers with Eutropia, the twice favored. Speaking of Eutropia, there are a couple cool things you can do with this card while it's in your deck, or vice versa, if it's in your opponent's deck, there are a couple weird ways that you can combat it in the format. Eutropia does give any target creature fly-in, so you can actually use that in conjunction with something like Plummet to take down any creature that your opponent controls. Or if you happen to have a card like Niley's Intervention, which is just a fine card that people kind of disrespect. They think it's unplayable, and it's not. But it can take out flyers for pretty cheap cost. Along with Eutropia, that means that you can combine these cards together to basically just be do-it-yourself murders, right? Makeshift murders. And that's not exactly something that comes up very often, but it is kind of sweet, right? Note that this works against your opponents as well. If they're playing Eutropias and you have a bunch of Plummets in your sideboard and Eutropia seems to be their win con, it might be worthwhile to bring Plummet in because it just kills whatever they end up targeting with Eutropia. The same goes for a card like Wings of Hubris, which is a card that people play way more often than they should. It's not very good, but when it's equipped, it does give the equipped creature flying, and that can start beating down. It has some extra text, too, that I don't put a lot of stock in, but if your opponent is trying to beat you down with Wings of Hubris, then go ahead and bring in your Plummets because it'll punish them for playing that equipment. For number 4, there's a neat little interaction that I wanted to go ahead and bring to people's attentions here. It's something that people might actually not be aware that they can do, or if they're playing Arena, it might allow them to do it due to, certain things highlighted at certain times, but people might not understand why you can do it. So let's take specifically the card Alseid of Life's Bounty. This is the 1 white 1/1 lifelinker, but more importantly, it says for 1 white mana, sacrifice Alseid of Life's Bounty. Target creature or enchantment you control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. Now, let's say Alseid of Life's Bounty is the only card that you control on board. So there's no targeting anything else here, right? And let's say your opponent says, okay, I'm just going to snap off my Revoke Existence to get rid of your Alseid of Life's Bounty. Just get it off the battlefield, exile it permanently, right? You can actually stop this, and I don't think a lot of people know that you can do this. The Alseid can actually target itself because it does not say that it has to be another creature or enchantment. And this is kind of weird because you have to sacrifice the Alseid of Life's Bounty as part of the cost in order to target. But one of the things, or one of the rules in Magic, is that whenever you're paying costs, you actually have to choose targets before you pay the cost of the card. So when you activate the Alseid's ability, you target first, which means the Alseid is going to target itself, and then you pay the cost. So after you've already targeted the Alseid, you sack the Alseid to give itself protection from a color, which won't matter because you've already sacrificed it. Now, this doesn't seem like a really big deal or anything, but in a format that's really dependent on graveyard synergies, this is a nice little way to make sure the card is going to your graveyard instead of being exiled. You might have a card like Omen of the Dead, and sure, Alseid of Life's Bounty is not the best creature to get back with that, but hey, it's better than nothing, right? Plus, on top of that, you just have Escape floating around this format, so every extra card that goes to the graveyard instead of being exiled can help fuel those Escape cards. Number 5 on our list is more of an overarching reminder to not forget about trinket text on cards. Trinket text is what I like to call those small little added abilities on a card that you basically don't think about when you're evaluating the card, or at least whenever you're playing it in a limited setting, it basically never comes up, so you don't really think about it, and then you just forget that the card has certain trinket text. A good example of this is Arvad from Dominaria, which said your other legendary creatures get +2/+2, and you just didn't really see that come up too often where you had a bunch of other legendary creatures on board, so you could forget that some of your other creatures were actually bigger. This is mitigated a lot on digital platforms like Arena, where you just see the difference. But if you're playing in paper, it's really easy to forget about trinket text. In the case of Theros Beyond Death, the one card that I see people just forget about all the time is Altar of the Pantheon. Now, this isn't like a big thing or anything, but it's more of a reminder that, hey, there's something here, don't forget about it. Altar of the Pantheon, sure, it adds 1 to each of your colors for devotion, but more importantly, the thing I'm talking about here is that when you tap it for mana, if you control a god, a demigod, or a legendary enchantment, you gain a life. And I just see a lot of people kind of forget that they can tap this for mana if they have a demigod just kind of sitting there on board. The board is stalled, people are just passing back and forth. You can tap your altar just to gain a life every turn. It might not do too much, you might not be using that mana, but it's an extra source of life gain. And the interesting thing here, as far as digital platforms go, especially Arena, is that this is a mana ability, which means it doesn't use the stack. It just kind of happens, and whenever you activate it, you just get the mana and the life gain happens. So if you're playing Arena and you tap this for mana, there's not going to be a trigger on the stack. You're not going to see, the stack go off or anything. You're not going to see an altar activation. Your life total is just going to go up by 1 really quickly, and you're going to get your mana. And if you're not paying attention, you might completely miss that. So don't forget, if you have a demigod, legendary enchantment, or if you're lucky and you have a god sitting on board, this just taps for 1 life every turn. The real wombo combo is with Heliod, where Altar of the Pantheon is actually just kind of busted. Heliod does fulfill the god condition, so you can just tap Altar to gain a life and get mana, which helps pay for the activated ability on Heliod, and the life gain actually triggers Heliod's ability as well. I actually found this out on accident when I tapped Altar for mana, and I suddenly had a Heliod trigger on Arena. So if you have a Heliod, I would actually consider taking Altar of the Pantheon highly, because everything the altar does works extremely well with Heliod. Speaking of Heliod, let's go ahead and talk about another god real quick. I think most people know this trick, but in particular we're talking about Thassa, Deep Dwelling. Now, Thassa has a bunch of abilities and all that devotion stuff, and blah blah blah, 6/5. It's a really cool card, it's very powerful, but the thing that I'm focused on here is the triggered ability on your end step, which says exile up to 1 other target creature you control. Very important. Then return that card to the battlefield under your control. Also extremely important. So you take a creature, whether you own it or not, you blink it, and then it's coming back in under your control. And if you only had that creature temporarily, you used a threaten effect to steal it from your opponent for the turn, it is now permanently your creature. Since it exiles, it comes back. It is treated as a new object, and Thassa specifically says it comes back under your control. Most blink effects these days just blink it back under the owner's control, but Thassa is a little bit different. In Theros Beyond Death, there are 2 main threaten effects that you'll see. One of them is the rare, A Crow in War. The other one is a common, which you'll see quite often, Portent of Betrayal. These can both steal creatures temporarily, but if you have a Thassa on board, they basically turn into permanent mind control effects. This is especially nice with the A Crow in War because they get their creature back at a certain point, and the Crow in War is kind of like this mini game in and of itself. Portent of Betrayal is a little bit weaker, but it is a common, right? You're not comboing your mythic with your other rare too often. So if you do have a Thassa and you end up in blue-red, then yeah, Portent of Betrayal should be something that you have your eye on a little bit higher. And that leads pretty nicely into number 7, which is just making sure you're using full value off of your sagas. Again, this is something that people are, I think, mostly familiar with, but the way it works on Arena, it's actually easy to kind of forget about certain things, especially when you transition to playing in paper. So if you have a saga, the way this works is once chapter 3 or once the final chapter goes on the stack, you have to wait for that ability to resolve before you sacrifice the enchantment or before you sacrifice the saga. So as long as that third ability is on the stack, the enchantment is actually still on the stack as well, which means that you can use that enchantment for some other effect or get some added benefit off of it before the enchantment goes away. And since the ability is already on the stack, you're going to get that ability back. The coolest thing to do, I think, is Flicker of Fate, which is just a great card in the set. It does a lot of things. But when chapter 3 of, let's say, Elspeth's Nightmare goes off, you can, in response to the ability, cast Flicker of Fate on the enchantment, have it come back in on chapter 1 again, still get the benefit of chapter 3, and just reset your saga. And you can do this with any saga. The interesting thing is that on Arena, in particular, if you don't play on full control mode, it has a habit of just running all the way through the ability if you don't go on full control. So if you want to use a trick, you have to make sure you set stops. Otherwise, it's just going to resolve the ability right away and sack the enchantment before you can do anything, because I guess Arena assumes you don't know how this stuff works or you don't want to use it. So be a little bit careful. But if you're playing in paper, this is pretty easy to announce, right? You just say, I'm going to put the ability of chapter 3 on the stack, and I'm going to respond to my own ability, right? And then you Flicker of Fate your saga, and you just get to kind of go off. You can also sacrifice the enchantment to an effect like Slaughter Priest of Mogus, which is pretty sweet. You get the added benefit of Slaughter Priest for the turn on an enchantment that was just going to go away anyway, and it's just a nice little way to take advantage of these sagas. Also note, Shimmerwing Chimera is a cool way to kind of combo sagas and make sure that you can keep reusing them. It does mean that you're not going to get the last chapter because you have to bounce it on your upkeep before the last chapter goes off on your draw step. But Shimmerwing Chimera does let you kind of keep recycling chapter 1 and 2, which could be very nice with something like a Metamized Prophecy or the first Iroan Games or something along those lines that just has really powerful chapter 1s and 2s. And that brings us to number 8, because we'll mention Shimmerwing Chimera here again, but Treacherous Blessing is a card I wanted to talk about here. This is a trap. Do not play this card unless you have ample ways to get it off of your board. Theros Beyond Death is a very grindy format, and the decks that aren't grinding are the ones that are going to be completely trying to beat you down, like the red-white hero decks or the red-white constellation decks or things like that. So Treacherous Blessing ends up being a lot of a liability more than a benefit, and it's not significantly better than something like Funeral Rites or, just a Thirst for Meaning or something like that that draws you a couple cards, maybe not pure raw card advantage like Treacherous Blessing, but gives you a little bit of card advantage and card selection without the negative downside of, losing 10 life for casting 10 spells. I think the coolest thing you can do here is Shimmerwing Chimera again, which will just make the Treacherous Blessing go away on your upkeep simply by targeting it. You don't get to actually bounce it back to your hand and keep drawing 3 cards or anything like that, but Shimmerwing just being on board means that you can probably cast your Treacherous Blessing and get away with it. Of course, you're going to do what everyone does to a Shimmerwing Chimera and kill it before any benefit happens with it, but if you manage to stick these 2 cards together, it's just basically 3 mana draw 3 with no downside. Obviously, you are looking for ways to sacrifice enchantments, and I think the real home for Treacherous Blessing is red-black, where you have plenty of ways to sacrifice enchantments, my favorite being Final Flare as a way to get the enchantment off board, but also take a creature out on the way out. So we just mentioned the red-white aggro decks, and one card that can fit in those decks, but I'm not fond of, is Thundering Chariot. This is the one random vehicle in this set. 4 mana, 3/3, crew 1. It has First Strike, Trample, and Haste. I had a feeling this card was going to be really good when I saw it, and it turns out it's fairly mediocre. Again, this is a format about grinding where board stalls happen quite a bit, and this isn't really a make it or break it type of card. I haven't seen too many board states where having a Thunder and Chariot really makes too big of a difference, right? It's not too hard to just stick like an aspect of mana core on a creature and just get a nice first striker that way, even if it is for a turn. And Thunder and Chariot does require you to tap down creatures, which, you know, not a huge deal, but it does matter. One thing I do like the Thunder and Chariot with, and this is actually a big ol' shout out to Mr. Tommy over here, who mentioned this in one of my comments, is that you can use the Thunder and Chariot to tap down your Underworld Rage Hounds, which is a card that I absolutely love if I'm drafting an aggressive deck. I have had plenty of aggressive decks where I just have 3, maybe even 4 Underworld Rage Hounds, and sometimes your opponent plays a 2/4, and the Rage Hound just kind of attacks into it. And yeah, you get the escape value, the thing can come back later, but I still don't like just throwing away the Rage Hounds. I want them to be on board in case something happens, or in case I can build out my board and get a really huge attack in, or something along those lines. Thunder and Chariot lets you tap the Underworld Rage Hounds down when it's not an opportune time to be attacking with them. They still can't block very well, but at least the Chariot makes it so that they can attack. You can also use this against Neshin Pig or Neshin Boar, which we'll talk about here in a second, as a way to tap down the creatures you don't want to block with. Not maybe the best strategy in the world, but a cute little interaction to keep in mind if you do end up with these decks with a ton of Rage Hounds in them. And that brings us to the Pig, the Neshin Boar, a card that I have found to be pretty strong in this format. I was a little skeptical of it when I first saw it. The fact that it can potentially draw your opponent a whole new hand, I don't know. I wasn't really super high on that. But I do find that there is enough ways to turn this into just a giant beater and crush your opponent with it that it is a card you should be first picking and trying to find ways to take advantage of it. Now, the thing I really wanted to mention here is that when I'm playing Neshin Boar, I see people just spewing value. They just give up so much value when they're playing against it. My opponent will have a removal spell. They're scared they're going to take 10. They don't want to block with their board and lose it, and they just pop the removal spell off on the board. Now, honestly, in most board states, this isn't necessarily wrong, right? You have to kill the board, but let the board do some work for you first. Block with all of your creatures, put the draw triggers on the stack, and then kill the Neshin Boar. That way you're just drawing free cards, right? Obviously, if your opponent's about to kill you, and they're swinging with a bunch of creatures, you might have to pop off the removal spell so that you can still block other creatures. But keep in mind, the boar can be a liability. If your opponent attacks with the boar and they're just sending a bunch of other creatures in there, assuming that those creatures are going to connect with you and not your creatures, you might be able to kill off the boar before blocks and then block their other creatures. But keep in mind, if you are digging for a removal spell, that you might draw those removal spells off of the board. Just always let the triggers resolve before you determine what to do, unless you are literally going to die before you get to choose your blocks. So you might draw a cheap removal spell and just blow your opponent out completely, and that's something that's hard to come back from. So I just wanted to make it aware that you should be more conscious of when you're using your removal spells when a boar is attacking you. Again, let your creatures block. Put all the triggers on the stack. If you already have a removal spell, go ahead and still let all of the triggers resolve, because you might find a cheaper removal spell or a more efficient play. And that, to me, seems like it's a good way to make the board backfire on itself. Closing out the last 5 tips here, we have one that I think is fairly obvious, and if you watched my Bifrost video for Red White Heroes, you know that I am not a big fan of that deck. I do think Red White in general sucks, but look, there are a couple weird and nice things you can do to just try to push in a win. In this case, we're talking about the card Wrap in Flames, which is a card you should probably be playing at least one of in your red-white aggro decks as a way to just get around blockers and push in for the win. But where this is really neat is with the heroes, which trigger whenever you target them with a spell that you control. So the obvious thing you can do here is use Wrap in Flames to target your opponent's creatures, maybe 1 or 2 of them, and using the last remaining ping to target one of your own heroes, which will trigger that ability in addition to locking down 2 of your opponent's blockers for the turn. Note that none of the heroes will actually die from a single ping, so this is pretty nice. And also note that this can't be fizzled by just removing one of the targets, since all of the targets need to be removed to make a spell fizzle. So Wrap in Flames, a lot of times you'll just use this targeting 3 of your opponent's creatures, making sure they can't block and attacking for either a bunch of damage or just alpha striking. But keep in mind, if you have heroes on board, you might actually need to do the math and see if it's more beneficial to target one of your heroes and stop 2 blockers just to pump your team and get more damage in that way. Number 12 on our list is less of a specific card interaction, more of just a priority that you should be making when it comes to exiling cards from your opponent's graveyard. I see a lot of times people have realized, well, yeah, you should exile the creatures from your opponent's graveyard, but after that, people just kind of do random things, and I find it a little bit strange sometimes, the decisions that people make when they're exiling cards from my graveyard, so I thought I would make it very clear. If your opponent has an escape card, that should be your number 1 priority. Let's say you're using a card like Scavenging Harpy or Timuret and you only have, enough exile equity to get rid of just a couple things. The first thing you should be prioritizing are escape cards, regardless of what they are. Your opponent won't have too many in their graveyard, but those are the things you want to get rid of, with Pharika's Spawn or the repeatable card draw being some of the better ones. But take out the creatures first and then take out the spells afterwards. But regardless of what they are, make sure the escape cards are the ones that get exiled first. After that, you should take out enchantments, because there are ways to take enchantments out of the graveyard and either put them back on top of your deck or just stick them back on the battlefield to a creature. Things like Rise from Gory or Rise to Gory can take an enchantment and just stick it directly back onto the battlefield. So once you've gotten rid of the powerful escape cards, you should be exiling the enchantments. And after that, you should take out basically any other permanent type. And the reason I say this, the reason you should be taking out, lands and artifacts over spells is because there really aren't ways to get spells back in this format, right? People see a card like Final Death and they're like, wow, that's a really powerful instant. I hope my opponent doesn't get to replay that. Let me go ahead and exile that. And honestly, you don't really have to do that, because you're not getting that Final Death back anyway. So you should take out permanents before you take out the Final Deaths or the instants and sorceries, because there are cards that can get permanents back, and even though a lot of times they won't target a land, maybe sometimes your opponent needs that land. Cards like the green-black uncommon that can get a permanent back from the graveyard, or the Binding of the Titans, which can get a land or creature back from the graveyard. If you prioritize getting rid of all permanent types before you get rid of instants and sorceries, you might be able to blank those cards and make it a lot worse for their options. Also note that this kind of works in reverse when it comes to exiling cards from your graveyard. Let's say you are escaping one of your own creatures, then you should exile your instants and sorceries first. Obviously, if you have a deck that has no possible way to get cards back from the graveyard, you have no Omens of Death or anything like that, it doesn't really matter too much what order you do this in, but if you have even 1 or 2 ways to return an enchantment from the graveyard to your hand or the battlefield, or you have a way to bounce a creature back from your graveyard to the hand or something like that, then you should go in reverse order. Getting rid of all your instants and sorceries first, and then getting rid of your artifacts and lands, and then keeping your enchantments and creatures for last. Number 13 is reserved on this list for a card that's near and dear to my heart. I'm just a big fan of Stinging Lionfish. When the set was first spoiled, I thought this card was going to be an all-star uncommon. Turns out it's underperformed a little bit, since it's not every single turn that you're going to be able to cast an instant, which means that sometimes this ability is just not there, and a 2-mana 2/1 enchantment creature is not exactly anything to write home about if the ability is not constantly working. But it is a pet card of mine. I'm a big fan of it in general, especially in grindy decks that are looking to cast a bunch of omens and things like that. Anytime you get to tap down one of your opponent's creatures just by casting an omen, it feels pretty good. But I wanted to bring it to people's attention that Stinging Lionfish can untap your permanents too, and this interacts pretty nicely with a couple key cards. Again, Heliod's Punishment, one of the cards that we've already mentioned. Stinging Lionfish is just a nice little way to get the Heliod's Punishment off your creature quicker, since you can tap that creature, cast a spell on your opponent's turn, untap the creature with Heliod's Punishment, and essentially remove another counter from it. And the other card here is Illyrios Enraptured, which stays tapped as long as you have that reflection token, but the Stinging Lionfish can get around that by untapping Illyrios. Note that these effects or these interactions also work with the common Hyrax Tower Scout. Not a high priority card, I don't see it played too often, but it's usually sitting around in my sideboard, and if I see that my opponent's playing a Heliod Punishment, or if I happen to have an Illyrios Enraptured, this is the type of card that I could probably put in my main deck or sideboard in against the punishment. Second to last here, I wanted to talk about an interaction with a couple of the bomb mythics in this set, the Elder Giants, Kroxa and Uro, and this won't come up too often, but it has come up in 1 or 2 matches for me, so I thought it was something that I would mention here. So the thing here is, let's imagine you have a Kroxa or Uro in your hand, and you really want to get it on the battlefield. You have to play it from your hand first. You know it's going to go to the graveyard, and then you're going to escape it afterwards, and you have enough mana to do that all in one turn. The problem is your opponent's sitting there with a Soul Guide Lantern or a Timoret, but let's go ahead and just use the Soul Guide Lantern, and it's just sitting on board, and at any point your opponent can exile your graveyard. Well, you want to get your creature onto the board because your mythic is probably going to win you the game, but you want to make sure that your opponent doesn't exile it before you get the chance to do so. So the way this works is when you cast one of these Elder Giants, you actually get 2 triggers that go on the stack. You get 1 trigger that says, I'm going to sacrifice myself. And you get a second trigger that says, I'm going to do the effect of drawing a card or my opponent discards a card, whatever the effect is, plus the sacrifice trigger. And this is, of course, assuming that we're casting it from our hand. If your opponent has instant speed, graveyard hate, whether it's Soul Guide Lantern or even just a card like Erebos' Intervention, and you want to avoid getting your creature exiled, what you want to do is put the sacrifice trigger on the stack first, and then put the actual ability on the stack second. So what'll happen is you will resolve the ability, and then you will resolve the sacrifice effect and put your card in the graveyard. But since the abilities are now all off the stack, you will have priority again because the stack is clear. And whenever the stack clears, you have priority until you give it back to your opponent. So if you resolve it in this order, the sacrifice trigger will resolve, and then the stack will be clear, and you will have priority again, meaning that you can just immediately cast your Titan from the graveyard for its escape cost before your opponent has a chance to actually act. What happens if you do it the other way around? So let's say you cast Kroxa from your hand, and you stack it so that the discard happens, or the discard is on the stack first, and then the sacrifice is on the stack second, so the opposite. Well, what'll happen here is that last ability will resolve, Kroxa will sacrifice itself and go to the graveyard, but you still have this other ability on the stack that says your opponent's going to discard a card and blah, blah, blah. The problem is you can't escape Kroxa while there's an ability on the stack because it's a sorcery speed action. So your opponent can now interact with their Soul Guide Lantern and exile the Kroxa out of the graveyard before you have a chance to actually cast it, because there's just another ability on the stack and your opponent can interact with that ability, right? So just to reiterate, you're casting your Titan, your opponent has Graveyard Hate on board, which they can activate at any point. Put the sacrifice trigger on the stack first, and then put the ability on the stack second, and let it resolve in reverse order, so that the last thing that happens is your Titan sacrifices itself, and then the stack will be clear, and you can cast your spell immediately after you regain priority. And let's wrap this up by, well, the title says it, talking about the Sphinx in the room. Dream Trawler is what I like to consider a little bit of a blemish on an otherwise fantastic limited format. It's very reminiscent of Tetzamok or Glorybringer. These just cards in really good formats that made it so that every time you went to FNM, there was some guy who had the Dream Trawler deck or the Glorybringer deck or the Tetzamok deck, and you always had to play against that guy, and it felt unfair when they had the card. Dream Trawler is one of those cards, and it's, you know, just this kind of design thing that I really hate, where giant hexproof creatures just kind of can't be interacted with. Well, I'm here to tell you there are a couple ways you can interact with a Dream Trawler. And let's be real, your chances of beating a Dream Trawler that just resolves on curve when you're not extremely far ahead, they're not very high. Dream Trawler will just win a very large percentage of games on its own when played on curve because it is that powerful of a card. But there are a couple ways to beat it. Now, the strongest ways, and if you happen to have just really good cards, are to use something like Shadow Spear or Entrance and Liar. Shadow Spear is actually the Dream Trawler killer, since it can just repeatedly take hexproof away from Dream Trawler. So if you have a cheap way to target Dream Trawler that's either going to kill it or neutralize it, and your opponent goes to discard a card and give itself hexproof, they can do that, but then you can activate Shadow Spear and take away hexproof. Your opponent can then discard another card to give it hexproof again, but then you can just pay a mana and take hexproof away again. So Shadow Spear is just a very strong card in general, and you're just going to play that in any deck. But if you happen to be the guy with Shadow Spear playing a guy against the person who happens to have Dream Trawler, well, it's a favorable interaction for you. Entrance and Liar is also just another powerful card. People have kind of caught on to this one. It's not a card you'll get late anymore. It's just a very strong card, and what it does is you pay X mana, you target a creature with X or less power, and that creature will not untap, plus you can keep the Entrance and Liar tapped down to keep that creature tapped down. This works favorably against Dream Trawler because either they let it resolve, and Dream Trawler is now just permanently tapped, and let's be real, you're never untapping the Entrance and Liar. But if they decide, hey, I don't want my Dream Trawler permanently tapped down, well, they can discard a card, but then Dream Trawler will tap itself, and you can just activate the Entrance and Liar again the following turn. Also note, when you're using Entrance and Liar against Dream Trawler, if you have spare mana, you should probably make X larger than Dream Trawler's current power, because if you go like X is 4, your opponent's Dream Trawler has 4 power because it hasn't attacked yet, and then in response they cast a draw spell like Thirst for Meaning, Dream Trawler will no longer get tapped from the Entrance and Liar, and then they don't have to discard a card. So be cognizant of the fact that your opponent can pump Dream Trawler at instant speed, so think about that when you're thinking about how much mana to spend on Entrance and Liar. Another way to get around Dream Trawler here is to flicker a Fate and enchantment onto it. I think this has been talked about ad nauseum, and a lot of people know the flicker trick now with something like Dreadful Apathy. But if you have an enchantment on board and you flicker a Fate it leaves the battlefield and then it just comes back in on a creature. It doesn't target that creature. So even if the creature has hexproof or shroud or something like that, the enchantment can still be attached to it because it never actually targets when it re-enters the battlefield. And if you have a card like Ichthyomorphosis or Dreadful Apathy on board, then you can flicker a Fate, targeting that card, and then immediately put it back on Dream Trawler, which should hopefully deal with the Trawler. The same goes with Rise to Glory, which can put an aura from the graveyard onto the battlefield. Again, not targeted, which means you can just take a Dreadful Apathy out of your graveyard and stick it on your opponent's Dream Trawler. And the same goes for Archon of Fallen Stars, which dies and returns an enchantment from the graveyard to the battlefield. And if you choose an aura, same deal. You can attach it to Dream Trawler, and your opponent cannot give it hexproof in response, or at least if they choose to, it will not stop the aura from attaching to Dream Trawler. Also wanted to mention that sweepers do kind of do the trick. Nylia's Intervention, good sideboard card against Dream Trawler. Shatter the Storm also does the trick. And while these are rares, you want to keep all your options open when you're talking about playing against the potentially, I think, consensus best card in the set. And that does it. Again, if you learned anything here, if you found any of this interesting, or if any of this gives you any help in future drafts or your FNM or anything like that, feel free to let me know. You can do so by subscribing below. Let me know that this content was worthwhile to make and it helped you out. Or you can leave a comment and let me know if something here actually helped you, or if somehow I got something wrong. You can leave a comment below and let me know as well, but I think most of the information here is on point. At any rate, thank you for joining me. There's plenty of Magic content on the web, and you chose to watch this video, so I appreciate you being here. You can subscribe below, as already stated, or you can find us on Twitter at MTG_Manarocks. That is all for this video. I hope these tips and tricks help you out in your next Theros draft, and I will see you all next time.